Alrighty, so as promised, it's May 1st, and I'm here with the first book I'm going to be covering on Dr. Jordan Peterson's recommended reading list. And that book is A Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Carl Jung. First, I wanted to start with who the author is. Carl Jung, who's been mentioned by Mr. Peterson several times.
Jung was
Besides being just an old white guy from Switzerland, he also contributed more to certain fields in psychology than probably anyone ever has. Actually, he pushed the bounds of psychology to its outer limits, and he disproved a lot of Sigmund Freud's misconceptions about the subconscious mind in regards to analytical psychology. So, how does this relate to us? Well, have you ever had a dream and just gone crazy wondering if it has any sort of meaning? Many psychologists believe that we only access a select few regions of our brain, and if we could access the rest, we would have access to a treasure trove of wisdom. This unaccessed part of our mind is known as the unconscious, and both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung agreed that this part of our mind attempts to communicate with us in certain ways, especially when we are asleep and through dreams, which is part of the reason it was given the name unconscious. Freud and Jung also believed that our unconscious mind needs allegory such as mythology, religion, and certain fairy tales in order for our subconscious mind to confront problems and find meaning in a variety of different ways. That is why certain stories have such a moralistic tune to them. For example, the story of Sleeping Beauty speaks of certain parents who sheltered their daughter completely from evil, and so this sheltering brought about a curse. And instead of being safe, once she reached the age where it was time for her to venture into the real world, it completely destroyed her. Or the story of Peter Pan, a boy who refused to grow up and accept responsibility. So he eventually lost everything and became the king of his own despondent Neverland and the leader of the band of lost boys. These books, ideas, and religions resonate with us because they speak truth in a personal but safe way. Culture and tradition shape our moralistic compass, and there's a reason so many of the stories are the same across continents, cultures, and throughout the centuries. And that is because our subconscious recognizes that they have meaning. This is where it gets incredibly interesting, and this is actually one key point that Jung and Freud fundamentally disagreed on. If the unconscious recognizes meaning before our conscious mind does, and it is naturally attracted to beauty and truth, it means that we exist for a purpose. It means that something deep inside of you recognizes that the universe or cosmos has a plan for you and that your life has meaning. Some even refer to the unconscious as the soul. This can be incredibly scary or super empowering, depending on how you look at it. For one thing, it means that you have an immense amount of responsibility, not only to discover your purpose, but to pursue it. And on the other hand, it means that you have the ability within you to discover your calling and use it to change the world. Again, we can discover a psychological archetype of our discovery in literature. Bilbo Baggins, for example, had to slay a dragon in order to become what he needed to be. And when he did, there was an immense reward. Another huge figure in the field of psychoanalysis actually authored the quote, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." You see, we all have caves we fear to enter into, and everyone has their own dragon that needs slaying in order to become who they need to be. Our conversation around the subconscious is where Freud and Jung generally fall into disharmony, which is discussed in chapter 6 of this book. While Freud believed that the unconscious is generally bad and consists of repressed tendencies found in the human unconscious and in literature, Jung believed that the unconscious mind is neither good or bad, but merely a symbolic opposite of the conscious mind. For example, in Greek mythology, incest, homosexuality, rape, and patricide were extremely common themes. And for some people, these themes manifest themselves in dreams. Jung, however, pointed out a variety of oddities appear in your subconscious state, even if you've never even consciously thought of them. Like a significant percentage of people don't ever think about incest or patricide, so Jung argues that they couldn't possibly repress something that never entered into their conscious mind to begin with. Instead, The conscious and unconscious mind should be understood as a sort of yin and yang. And this is where the psychological law of opposites comes into play. Whatever your conscious mind is thinking, as a rule, your unconscious mind wants to balance out. So if you change your conscious outlook, it is very possible that your unconscious outlook will change as well. The law of opposites is extremely important for us to understand and to accomplish our purpose in life. If we have no capacity for evil, we have no capacity for good. Without darkness, there is no light. I think that is why in Christianity, before Christ could be exalted, he descended into hell. Even the perfect man could not grasp heaven without his reality identifying in some way with hell. You need to be capable of great harm in order to be capable of good. Your unconscious understands that without need for articulation. Jung puts so much credence into the unconscious mind that he believes that it has the power to make one ill or heal somebody. And it's incredibly fascinating that as much as 90% of illnesses are at least in part, if not wholly, caused by stress, according to medical professionals. Here are a couple of direct quotes regarding Jung's treatment of patients with various illnesses that he believed came directly from their subconscious. I was consulted by a man who held a prominent position in the world. He was afflicted with a sense of anxiety and insecurity, and complained of dizziness, sometimes resulting in nausea, of a heavy head, and difficulty in breathing. This being an exact description of the symptoms of mountain sickness. He had had an unusually successful career and had risen, with the help of ambition, industry, and native talent, from a humble origin as the son of a poor peasant. Step by step he had climbed, attaining at last an important post that offered him every opportunity for further social advancement. He had actually reached a place in life from which he could have begun his ascent into the upper regions, when suddenly his neurosis intervened. At this point of his story, the patient could not refrain from that stereotyped exclamation, which begins with the familiar words, "And just now, when I..." The fact that he had all the symptoms of mountain sickness was highly appropriate to the peculiar situation in which he found himself. He had brought with him to the consultation 2 dreams of the preceding night. The first dream was as follows. I am once more in the small village where I was born. Some peasant boys who went to school with me are standing together in the street. I walk past them, pretending not to know them. I hear one of them, who is pointing at me, say, "He doesn't often come back to our village." No tricks of interpretation are needed to recognize and to understand the allusion to humble beginnings of the dreamer's career. The dream says quite clearly, "You forget how far down you began." Here is the second dream. I am in a great hurry because I am going on a journey. I hunt up my baggage but cannot find it. Time flies and the train will soon be leaving. Finally, I succeed in getting all of my things together. I hurry along the street, discover that I have forgotten a briefcase containing important papers, and dash breathlessly back again, find it at last, and then run towards the station, but make hardly any headway. With a final effort, I rush onto the platform, only to find the train steaming out into the yards. It is very long and runs in a curious S-shaped curve. It occurs to me that if the driver is not careful and puts on full steam when he comes to the straight stretch, the rear coaches will be on the curve and it will be thrown over by the speed of the train. As a matter of fact, that driver opens the throttle as I try to shout. The rear coaches rock frightfully and are actually thrown off the rails. There is a terrible catastrophe, and I awake in terror. Here, too, we can understand without much difficulty the situation represented by the dream. It pictures the patient's frantic haste to advance himself still further. Since the driver at the front of the train goes thoughtlessly ahead, the coaches behind him rock and finally overturn. That is, a neurosis is developed. It is clear that, at this period of his life, the patient had reached the highest point of his career, and that the effort of the long ascent from his lowly origin had exhausted his strength. He should have contented himself with his achievements, but instead he is driven by his ambition to attempt to scale heights of success for which he is not fitted. The neurosis came upon him as a warning. Carl Jung then goes on to tell about how he did not listen to Jung's view, and his life went drastically wrong in his profession and beyond because he did not heed his unconscious's warning. Another example from the book goes as follows. I am reminded of a case which is very instructive in this connection. It concerns a highly intelligent young man who had worked out a detailed analysis of his own neurosis after a serious study of medical literature. He brought me his findings in the form of a precise and well-written monograph fit for publication and asked me to read the manuscript and tell him why he was not cured. He should have been, according to the verdict of science as he understood it. After reading his monograph, I was forced to grant him that, if it were only a question of insight into the causal connections of a neurosis, he should in all truth be cured. Since he was not, I suppose this must be due to the fact that his attitude to life was somehow fundamentally wrong, though I had to admit that all his symptoms did not betray it. In reading his accounts of his life, I had noticed that he often spent his winters at St. Moritz or Nice. I therefore asked him who paid for these holidays, and it thereupon came out that a poor schoolteacher who loved him had cruelly deprived herself to indulge the young man in these visits to pleasure resorts. His want of conscience was the reason of his neurosis, and it is not hard to see why scientific understanding failed to help him. His fundamental error lay in his moral attitude. He found my way of looking at the question shockingly unscientific, for morals have nothing to do with science. He supposed that, by invoking scientific thought, he could spirit away the immorality which he himself could not stomach. He would not even admit that a conflict existed because his mistress gave him the money of her free will. We can take what scientific position we choose. There remains the fact that the large majority of civilized persons simply cannot tolerate such behavior. The moral attitude is a real factor in life, which the psychologist must reckon if he is not to commit the gravest errors. The psychologist must also remember that certain religious convictions not founded on reason are a necessity of life for many persons. This illustrates something extremely interesting, which these two dreams knock at the heart of. Not only does our unconscious recognize meaning, it also recognizes morality. In fact, as Jung puts it, a psyche without the allowance for the existence of the divine or spiritual matters limits psychology to a mere flickering of electrons in the human brain. No free will, and it would require for this flickering of energy to have some sort of moral code and knowledge of purpose and meaning in one's life. In my humble opinion, that requires an even greater amount of belief than the belief in a God. All of this information begs the question, why did Jordan Peterson recommend it? Well, I could think of a myriad of reasons. But in summation, I would say this. He deeply desires for people to discover their purpose and thinks that if they do, the world would be a better place. People believing their lives have meaning set them on a good course the majority of the time, and I think the human condition is hopeless without that belief. I also think he recognizes the unconscious as an extremely valuable guide if understood, and I think he wants us to have that as we journey ahead, full speed, with no crashes.